And I'm sorry to disappoint everyone, but Dr. Bird sends his profound apologies. He spent almost 2 hours between yesterday and today trying to sign on, trying computers in and out of the office, and just the technical challenges were too much for him to overcome. Fortunately, he's overcome a lot of the clinical challenges for us patients in CLL, and I won't, I'm sure, do the same kind of job he did. He would have done with the slides. The good news is that he's agreed to set up a separate Zoom interview with us, and we'll go over his slide presentation in more detail and be able to flesh that out. But I'm going to cover just some of the high-level points. And Dr. Parikh set me up beautifully with clinical trials because that's the only way we advance the knowledge. So let's talk a little bit about clinical trials here. And the first and most important thing is what issues need to be solved. And this is why patients need to be involved from the very beginning of clinical trials, because patients knows what's important to us. And while improving from a 2-month survival to a 3-month survival of 50% improval, that's statistically important, but the 30 days, while it's something, isn't what most patients are going for. Most patients are going for quality of life and durability of life issues. So it's really important that patients be involved from the get-go of clinical trials and be involved in that design of them. Usually they involve in developing a compound, a new molecule. It could be some kind of protein-based thing, or nowadays it could be a cell product. But there are trials that were referenced earlier that involve getting people involved in exercise or certain nutrition or even meditation and other things to see how they help. We need to demonstrate that these new processes that we're trying have some activity, and we start in cells, and then we move on to mouse models and sometimes larger primate models for CLL and related diseases. And what about the drug? Is it absorbed properly? You know, we could have a great drug, but is there a problem getting it into us? What about its toxic side effects? How does it interact with other drugs? And if we get those kinds of things answered before we've done human studies, we can file an IND, an investigational new drug application. So let's just quickly review what kind of clinical trials there are. So phase 1 trials are ostensibly to find out what the effective dose of the drug is. And they start at a very low dose, make sure that there's no adverse events. Then they move up to a higher dose and a higher dose and a higher dose until they reach what are called dose limiting toxicities, DLT. And they say, okay, we push this as far as we can, and we're starting to get some side effects that are significant. So we know the dose just before that is probably the dose that we're going to go at. Now, ostensibly, I said that these are about the effective dose, but obviously, when you're doing these trials, people are looking to see, is it effective? Is the drug working? Is it having any benefit? And the trials aren't designed to look at that, but believe me, that's being looked at. Phase 2 trials, and phase 1 trials are very small trials with just handfuls of patients being used to demonstrate the safety. Phase 2 trials, we look at a single disease in a single state. Generally, that's the way phase 2 trials are. So we say, and usually it's to find there's some unmet need. So in CLL, that might be in relapsed patients. It might be in treatment naive frontline therapy, but usually it's in relapsed patients. And now we know what that term means. And it's not compared to standard therapy. We're just seeing, is it safe and is it effective? So the first was the dose. Now let's look at its safety and let's look at its efficacy. But the real acid test for efficacy is the much larger, with hundreds and even thousands of patients, which is a phase 3 trial. And these are sometimes called registration trials because these are the trials that allow the drug to become commercially available. And they examine the efficacy, and there's 2 different kinds. There's a non-randomized trial where if there was no treatment available. So, for example, it's not compared to a standard therapy. So one you might be able to understand would be that we could use as a comparison now would be a COVID vaccine. We could give some people a COVID vaccine. There isn't another arm that we could say, we'll try this COVID vaccine versus that COVID vaccine, because we don't have any approved COVID vaccine. So one arm gets the COVID vaccine, the other arm doesn't get the COVID vaccine, and we see how many people get COVID. But the way in CLL that works is that nobody is in a placebo arm, because there are good standard therapies that are available for patients, and we're compared to that. Now, one of the criticisms of old trials is they set up a straw man and they looked at the weakest possible comparator. So something like chlorambucil, which is hardly used in the US anymore, was used. But the FDA has tightened down on that, and patients are no longer having to go to a weak comparator arm, but are generally randomized to a very good trial that's standard of care versus a new investigational trial. Phase 4 trials are done after the drug is already approved, and to see if there's any new concerns or any new treatment options available. So what's involved? The physician presents you the option versus sometimes you can find one on your own through clinicaltrials.gov, compares that to standard care that's available. You can get outside of the trial. There is an extraordinarily involved consent counseling. Somebody goes through the pages and pages, set aside an hour or two to read through this and go through this log book of signatures and making sure that you understand it and everything. And please do ask questions. Generally, there's screening to make sure you're eligible for the trial. For example, certain diseases or prior treatments or certain active problems will interfere. You can't have an active infection usually. You can't be pregnant. There's certain age criteria. And then treatment begins once you've screened, you've signed the consent, and you continue until there's adverse events or progression on treatment. Sometimes the treatments will go out for years and years, and they'll end the trial after that. Follow-up tends to be less frequent as the trial goes out further. So this is Dr. Bird talking, and when he says when he was an intern in 1991, there was one effective treatment for CLL, and all patients who became symptomatic would die from it. But now we have all these new treatments, and he lists just some of them. And life expectancy now, even for some patients who had need for treatment, is similar to patients who are age and gender matched who don't have CLL. Just think about that. Your CLL needs treatment, but with the new therapies, you can live the same as someone else your age and gender. Clinical trials have taught us, among other things, taught us what works and what doesn't work, what has unacceptable side effects. In clinical trials, and you can look at this as a double-edged sword, advantage and disadvantage. They have increased monitoring, and any clinician will tell you as a patient comes in, and as a result of the increased monitoring, they found a spot on the lung that wouldn't have been found otherwise, that was life-saving because they had a scan that otherwise wouldn't have been done. But the other part of a clinical trial is you have a ton of scans and bone marrow biopsies and blood tests that can be awful annoying and can carry some risk with them too. So how do you know if a trial is right for you, and how does it match where you're at the disease? So phase 1 trials generally used for patients who have less options. 1Bs are where you've been priorly treated for the CLL. Early phase 2 trials may be prior treatment, but the drug hasn't been proven to be effective. I was in a 1B2 trial of PCI 32765, which later became ibrutinib. So I was lucky, and I choose a drug that we all have heard a lot about tonight. And from phase 2 trials through phase 3 trials, late phase 2 and phase 4 trials, that's where you tend to see the previously untreated and treated CLL trial. So you talk to your doctor, and generally the doctor is going to fudge. My experience hasn't been that the doctor said, this is the best choice for you. Generally, they say, here's a couple options for you. Please consider these. And they can be hard to nail down on what they think. Even when you try the tricks, well, what would you do if it was your family member? They'd say, well, I'd lay out the options and let them decide. So yeah, you have to listen very carefully, have someone else in the room listening and helping you decide, where to go forward. All right. So is this trial going to work for me? Is it doable? Do I have to live in the city where it is? What are the travel requirements? What does your gut tell you? Is it a good option for me? Other important questions. What happens if it doesn't work for me? What else do I have left? Does this cut off other options? What if I'm harmed by a trial? Will insurance cover that? Can I leave the trial at any point if I'm not happy with the care I'm getting or what's going on? I think there's a better option. The answer is yes. Could the trial cost me out of pocket expenses? You bet it could. Not the trial drugs are usually covered, but not always. But standard of care is usually your responsibility, and that can involve a lot of testing, more than usually done in a really honest standard of care setting, where you probably wouldn't be getting a CAT scan every 3 months. So, a concluding statement that Dr. Bird has made famous is clinical trials are for the patient, not patients for clinical trials. And I think I heartily agree with that. So, thank you very much.